You know, when we usually talk about eradicating global poverty, there's this deeply ingrained expectation that it's going to be a really slow, grueling, multi-generational slog.
Oh, absolutely. Like moving a mountain with a teaspoon.
Exactly, like you think of massive UN summits, decades of these tiny incremental policy shifts, giant bureaucratic machines churning away, and maybe, just maybe, your great-grandchildren will see a world without extreme deprivation.
Yeah, it's historically viewed as this incredibly complex, almost insurmountable sociological condition, like a permanent fixture of human civilization that we can really only hope to manage, not actually cure.
Right, like the weather. You can build shelters to mitigate the rain, but you can't just, turn off the storm.
I mean, that's how we've always looked at it.
But then you step into the world of tech philosophy and systems design, and suddenly that whole mountain-moving metaphor just feels entirely outdated.
Totally.
Because we are looking at a blueprint today that doesn't treat poverty as some unsolvable sociological mystery. It literally treats it as an engineering problem.
Which is, I mean, it's the absolute definition of a paradigm shift. Moving from all that political hand-wringing to just pure scalable plumbing.
Yeah.
Because if it's an engineering problem, that means the solution is really just a matter of architecture, right?
Right.
Bandwidth, processing power, that kind of thing.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today on this deep dive. We're looking at a really provocative manifesto, published today, actually, March 25, 2026.
Fresh off the press.
Yep. By author and tech philosopher Paramendra Kumar Bhagat. It's titled Netizen, The Fastest Way to Eliminate Poverty.
It's quite a title.
It really is. And it proposes this radical three-step technological and economic stack that's basically designed to end extreme poverty effectively overnight.
Which is a massive claim.
Massive. But before we dive into the actual mechanics of this poverty-ending machine, we really need to put a pin in something because we are stepping into a massive economic and political minefield here.
Oh, yeah. We absolutely are. I mean, this blueprint involves some highly combustible concepts.
Exactly. So Bhagat's proposal relies heavily on universal basic income. Specifically, unconditional cash transfers to the bottom 10%. And he suggests funding this through targeted quantitative easing.
Right, which essentially means a central bank just printing money directly for social welfare.
Which people have very strong feelings about. So just to be absolutely clear up front to you listening right now, we are not here to play politics or take sides on whether this is some beautiful utopian dream or a fast track to hyperinflation.
Definitely not. People have deeply entrenched positions on whether printing money for direct cash transfers will save the world or completely destroy the economy.
Yeah.
And our role here is really just to lift the hood and look at the engine. We're going to explore the mechanics, the logic, and the arguments of the architecture exactly as they are laid out in the manifesto.
Without declaring if the engine itself is inherently good or bad, we're acting strictly as impartial guides today.
Just looking at the blueprint.
Exactly. So here is how we are going to break down this journey. First, we have to look at the plumbing, because you can't distribute resources if you don't have a frictionless grid. Right?
No, the pipes have to be laid first.
Right. So we're looking at universal digital identity and instant banking. Then second, we look at the fuel, the highly debated cash bazooka, and the mechanics of that turlet and QE we mentioned.
And finally, the force multiplier.
Yes. Deploying native language AI tutors to literally every smartphone.
It is a really dense stack, but the logic flows sequentially. Like you really can't execute step 2 without step 1.
So let's start with step 1, the infrastructure. Bhagat points out that governments have historically spent trillions on welfare schemes, subsidies, and these massive bureaucracies, only to watch inefficiency, leakage, and red tape basically swallow the money before it actually reaches a single person in need.
Right. It's the classic leaky bucket problem in macroeconomics.
Explain that for us.
Sure. So you pour, let's say, $1 billion at the top of a traditional welfare state. By the time it trickles down through all the administrative layers.
The paperwork, the offices.
Exactly. The eligibility assessments, the physical logistics of moving the money or goods, the inevitable corruption, and just general systemic friction. Only a tiny fraction of that initial value actually reaches the citizen.
So the proposed solution here is to basically throw the bucket away and build a high-speed pipeline.
Exactly.
And the first pillar of that is universal digital identity and instant banking. Now, the manifesto uses India's Aadhaar program as the ultimate proof of concept for this.
And it's a wild proof of concept.
It is. Let's really dig into what Aadhaar actually is, because the sheer scale of it is kind of hard to comprehend. This was launched back in 2009 by the Unique Identification Authority of India.
Yeah, and at its core, Aadhaar is a 12-digit unique identification number. But it's not like a piece of cardboard, like a U.S. Social Security card, which, is notoriously easy to forge or steal.
Right, it's just paper.
Yeah, but Aadhaar is entirely backed by biometrics. So to get this number, a resident actually provides their fingerprints, an iris scan, facial recognition data, and their basic demographic details.
And by early 2026, the data shows over 1.4 billion Aadhaar numbers have been issued.
Wow.
Which is virtually the entire adult population of India, plus a ton of children. I mean, think about the logistical reality of that. Back in 2009,
it's staggering.
You have this massive, incredibly diverse country. A huge portion of the population is living in rural areas, and millions of them are completely undocumented.
Right, and that's the foundational crisis of a developing economy. I mean, if you have no birth certificate, no passport, no utility bill in your name,
You basically don't exist to the government.
You effectively don't exist to the formal financial system at all. You have no way to prove to a bank or a hospital or a government agency that you are who you say you are.
So you're locked out.
Completely locked out. Aadhaar was engineered to solve that single fundamental query, which is, I am who I say I am, and my physical body is the cryptographic proof.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Imagine turning a country's entire population into a giant high-speed motherboard.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Every single human being becomes a verified, frictionless node on a national financial grid. But identity alone doesn't actually move money, right?
No, it doesn't.
Knowing who someone is doesn't put food on their table. And this is where the blueprint highlights something called the JAM Trinity.
Right. JAM is an acronym, and it represents the integration of 3 distinct networks. So the J stands for Yandan, which was a massive national scheme to open zero-balance bank accounts for the unbanked.
Okay.
Then A is for Aadhaar, the biometric identity we just talked about, and M is for mobile, the smartphone connection.
And when you link those 3 things together, the transformation is honestly wild.
It really is.
You take a biometric identity, you link it to a bank account that requires 0 minimum balance, and you connect that to a mobile phone number. Suddenly, a previously undocumented citizen is a fully integrated digital actor.
Yeah.
And the key here is how these accounts are actually opened. It utilizes something called EKYC.
Right. Electronic Know Your Customer. What's fascinating here is the speed and the paperless nature of it, because in a traditional banking system, know your customer laws require you to bring physical documents to a branch, right?
Right, proof of address, photo ID, all that stuff.
Exactly, to prevent money laundering. And it takes days or sometimes weeks to verify. But with EKYC, a person in a remote village just goes to a local banking correspondent.
Like a shopkeeper with a scanner.
Yeah, exactly. They place their finger on a biometric scanner, the scanner pings the central Aadhaar database, confirms their identity instantly, and boom, the bank account is open on the spot.
No.
It is entirely paperless.
And then all of these accounts are wired together through India's Unified Payments Interface, or UPI, which is their real-time payment infrastructure.
Yeah.
So think of it this way. Instead of a society functioning like this chaotic web of physical paper trails and cash handoffs, you turn the entire population into verified nodes on a national financial network.
Everyone is connected.
Every human being becomes a frictionless endpoint. You aren't mailing checks. You aren't loading up diesel trucks with bags of subsidized rice. You are routing digital packets of financial value directly to the human node.
And that network architecture, it fundamentally alters state capacity. I mean, in a legacy system, to send disaster relief or welfare to a poor citizen, the government has to identify them,
Track them down.
verify their eligibility through a local official, issue a paper voucher, and then the citizen has to physically travel to a distribution center, wait in line, and probably pay fees or bribes along the way.
But on this digital grid.
On the grid, the Treasury just hits send, and the money arrives in the citizen's mobile wallet in milliseconds. The friction drops effectively to 0.
The manifesto leans heavily on this. It argues that scaling a system to deliver poverty-ending cash is no longer this political impossibility. It is literally merely an issue of server load and database management.
Exactly. The technological hurdles have already been cleared.
So once this human motherboard is built, what happens when a government actually routes resources through it? Let's move to the actual documented economic triumphs of this system.
Right. The direct benefit transfers, or DBT.
The numbers cited here are astronomical. By early 2026, The cumulative savings from bypassing the old bureaucracy and using Aadhaar-enabled transfers reached approximately 3.48 lakh crore rupees.
Which translates to roughly 49 billion US dollars.
Just saved.
Saved simply by changing the delivery mechanism. Not by cutting actual benefits, but just by eliminating the leaks in the pipe.
So how exactly does a delivery mechanism save $49 billion? The text points to something really interesting called the ghost-busting effect.
Ah, yes, ghost busting.
Over half of those savings, about 1.85 lakh crore rupees, came purely from the food subsidy program, the public distribution system. And it was saved by algorithmic deduplication that weeded out 5.2 crore ghost beneficiaries.
Let's unpack the mechanics of a ghost beneficiary because it perfectly illustrates the banality of systemic corruption.
Please do.
In a paper-based welfare system, local distributors maintain these physical ledgers of people entitled to subsidized grain. Without biometric verification, a corrupt official can easily invent fake names, keep deceased individuals on the active list, or create duplicate profiles for real people.
So they write down John Doe 3 times, claim 3 sacks of rights from the government, give 1 to the real John Doe, and sell the other 2 on the black market.
Exactly. It's a massive decentralized drain on the treasury. But when you introduce biometric deduplication, that entire shadow economy basically collapses overnight.
Because of the fingerprint matching.
Right. Deduplication means that when a new Aadhaar record is created, the system compares that fingerprint and iris scan against the entire database of 1.4 billion existing records.
In milliseconds.
Yes. So if that local official tries to register John Doe a second time to get extra rations, the algorithm flags the biometric match. You cannot fake a fingerprint for a non-existent person.
Right.
When India fully integrated this, 52 million fake identities were instantly wiped from the welfare rolls.
That is mind-boggling. 52 million ghosts. And they apply this to cooking gas subsidies, pensions, and scholarships too. The system also automatically cross-referenced databases to remove ineligible people, right?
Yeah.
Like if you were filing income tax or owned significant land or were a government employee, the system flagged you and removed you from schemes that were meant for the absolute poorest.
It cleans up the data immensely.
And in the financial year 2026 alone, disbursements hit 5.6 lakh crore rupees, reaching 176 crore beneficiaries.
It just proves the architecture can handle a massive volume of transactions without buckling under the pressure.
But wait, let's look at this from the ground level. We are throwing around massive macroeconomic numbers here. Billions of dollars saved, millions of ghosts busted.
Sure.
But saving the treasury money doesn't automatically mean the person at the bottom is actually living a better life. So I'm asking you, the listener, to ponder this.
Yeah.
Is this just an accounting victory for the state? Or does it actually alter the daily reality of poverty?
Well, it alters the daily reality by introducing predictability, which is arguably the most valuable currency for someone living in extreme poverty.
Tell me more about that.
The money that used to vanish into the pockets of the local ledger keepers is now arriving in the intended recipient's account with absolute cryptographic reliability.
But why does predictability matter so much in the day-to-day?
Because poverty imposes a massive cognitive and psychological tax. Think about it. If your family relies on a government ration, but you know from experience that the local distributor might steal half of it.
Or your voucher gets delayed.
Right, delayed by 3 months because of some bureaucratic error. You live in a state of chronic financial terror. You are forced into what behavioral economists call precautionary savings.
Okay.
Even if your kids are hungry today, you might hoard a tiny bit of cash or food because you just cannot trust the system to deliver your next meal tomorrow.
So you are constantly hedging against systemic failure.
Precisely. But if the subsidy arrives in your digital account on the exact same day every single month, down to the minute, the anxiety drops.
Wow.
The text highlights studies showing that this frictionless delivery reduces the need for those precautionary savings. People can actually plan their consumption. They can invest that small surplus into a local business or their children's education because they trust the plumbing.
And the financial inclusion data totally backs this up. Over 57.78 crore Yanton bank accounts were opened by February 2026.
That's hundreds of millions of people.
Hundreds of millions of human beings brought into the formal economy, specifically targeting women and rural households. And for those in ultra-remote areas without smartphones, the system powers something called AEPS, the Aadhaar-enabled payment system.
This is a really crucial piece of the infrastructure. AEPS allows a person to walk up to a local banking correspondent, again, basically a shopkeeper with a handheld micro ATM, enter their Aadhaar number, scan their fingerprint, and withdraw physical cash from their digital account.
That's amazing.
They don't need a debit card, they don't need a PI, and they don't even need a phone. Their body is literally the access key to their liquidity.
And the manifesto notes that, structurally, this has led to a dramatic reduction in poverty, dropping from roughly 47% in the early 1990s to single digits by the 2020s.
Yeah.
Furthermore, it explicitly highlights how routing cash directly into women's bank accounts bypasses traditional patriarchal controls, drastically improving their economic agency. So according to Pagat, the engine works, the plumbing is flawless.
But
There's always a but. And this is where we have to look at the dark side of this architecture. Because when you are engineering a system for 1.4 billion human lives, systemic friction isn't just a dropped Wi-Fi connection or a 404 error page.
no, the friction has devastating physical consequences.
Exactly. We have to talk about the glitches in the matrix.
The manifesto itself really has to reckon with the sheer human cost of centralized biometric mandates.
The exclusion errors. Because the data shows that biometric authentication fails 8 to 10% of the time. Now, in software development, if a new feature works 90% of the time right out of the gate, that's a massive win, right?
Oh, yeah. You ship it and you patch the bugs in version 2.0.
Right. But if 10% of 1.4 billion people fail authentication, that is 140 million people falling through the cracks, why is the failure rate so high?
Well, this raises an important question about the limits of technology, because technology is built in sterile labs, right? But poverty exists in the physical world.
Right.
A biometric scanner expects a clean, distinct pattern of ridges on a fingertip. But if you are a manual laborer, say a bricklayer, or an agricultural worker pulling crops with your bare hands for 40 years, that physical labor literally erases your identity.
Wait, really? The ridges just wear off?
Exactly. The ridges on your fingers wear down to smooth skin.
So your body is eroded by the work you have to do to survive, then the system designed to help you survive can no longer recognize your body. That is, wow.
It is a brutal irony. And you also have the elderly, whose fingerprints fade naturally with age or whose eyes develop cataracts, causing iris scans to fail.
Right, biological factors.
And beyond the physical biology, there is the infrastructure layer. The micro ATM in a remote village has to ping a central server hundreds of miles away to verify the fingerprint. If the local cell tower is down or the internet is spotty, the machine just times out.
And the real-world impact of a server timeout is terrifying. The text highlights extreme cases, pointing to surveys in places like Jharkhand that estimated exclusion rates as high as 20% in fully Aadhaar-mandated ration outlets.
20%.
1 in 5 people showing up for legally mandated food being turned away by a machine. The text notes reports of actual starvation deaths directly linked to these authentication failures.
Which forces us to confront the core ethical vulnerability of replacing human bureaucracy with algorithmic certainty. Because in the old paper-based system, for all its corruption, there was human discretion. A local distributor might look at a manual labor and say, look, I know the ledger is damaged and I know your fingerprints are worn down, but I've known you for 20 years. Here is your rice.
The human could override the system.
Exactly. But a machine is binary. It returns a 1 for a match or a 0 for a fail. Food or no food. When you remove human discretion to eliminate corruption, you also eliminate human empathy in edge cases.
Which begs the question, if the system is 90% perfect, but the 10% who fail are the absolute most vulnerable, the elderly, the manual laborers, the digitally disconnected, is that acceptable collateral damage for macroeconomic efficiency?
This synthesizes the ultimate trade-off perfectly. The immense efficiency gains versus the severe risks of exclusion. Success absolutely requires offline fallbacks. You cannot impose a rigid biometric mandate for survival resources without a manual override.
Right.
If the technology fails, there must be a legally protected alternative to verify identity, or the system effectively weaponizes efficiency against the poorest.
And exclusion isn't the only structural risk. There is the persistent fear of mass surveillance. When you build a single centralized vault containing the biometric markers and demographic profiles of over 1 billion people.
You've created the ultimate honeypot.
Exactly, for cybercriminals. and an unprecedented tool for state surveillance.
The source acknowledges this tension too. While the core biometric vault itself is heavily encrypted, there have been numerous data leaks over the years involving third-party services like banks, telecom operators, local government portals that connect to the Aadhaar database.
And the text mentions the 2018 Supreme Court ruling in India, which upheld Aadhaar as constitutional but tried to put guardrails on it. They struck down its mandatory use for private entities, basically saying you shouldn't need a biometric scan just to buy a phone plan or open a private bank account.
Right.
Yet, the manifesto notes the persistent issue of Aadhaar creep.
Aadhaar creep is the systemic inertia where a digital ID slowly becomes the de facto requirement for all societal participation.
How does that happen if the court struck it down?
Well, even if a law says you don't have to provide your Aadhaar to enroll your child in school or check into a hotel, the bureaucratic friction of choosing the non-Aadhaar alternative becomes so overwhelmingly difficult that participation is effectively coerced.
Ah, I see.
It sets a really complex global precedent regarding how much biometric data a state can demand in exchange for existing in modern society.
So we have this awe-inspiring, transformative grid. It slashes corruption, destroys the shadow welfare economy, and routes liquidity directly to the marginalized faster than ever thought possible.
Yes.
But it comes with profound inherent risks of digital exclusion and privacy erosion. However, for the sake of Bhagat's manifesto, he argues that the grid works well enough to serve as the foundation for his real gambit.
Right. Step one is really just the prerequisite. Now we move to what is actually being pushed through the pipe.
And this is where we get to step 2, the cash bazooka. Unconditional cash transfers to the bottom 10%, funded by targeted quantitative easing.
If the biometric grid was an engineering debate, this is a full-blown macroeconomic war zone.
Oh, absolutely. Let's lay out the exact parameters of Bhagat's proposal. He suggests automatic, unconditional monthly cash transfers. And we aren't talking about a token stimulus check here.
Yeah.
He says the transfer must be mathematically large enough to lift every single recipient in the bottom decile completely above the poverty line. Enough to secure food, shelter, healthcare, and basic dignity.
The critical words here are automatic and unconditional. There is absolutely no means testing bureaucracy.
Means testing being the process where the government makes you prove you are poor enough to deserve help.
Exactly. In Western welfare models, you have armies of caseworkers, mountains of forms, drug tests, work requirements, and constant reevaluations.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
Bhagat argues that this bureaucracy often costs as much to administer as the actual welfare it distributes, and it traps the recipient in a labyrinth of humiliation.
Yeah.
His blueprint envisions a system where the poorest 10% are identified passively, using the vast streams of data already flowing through the digital ID and banking grid.
So if the algorithm determines you fall into that bottom decile, the money just appears in your Yandan account on the 1st of every month.
Boom. It's just there.
You don't apply for it. You don't have to prove you spent it on nutritious food instead of a television. You just receive it until your broader economic footprint indicates you have climbed out of the bottom 10%.
It is the ultimate expression of trust in the individual over the state apparatus.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because anyone who has ever taken Econ 101 is currently pulling their hair out.
Oh, I'm sure they are.
How do you pay for a permanent massive cash infusion for 10% of a nation's population? If you raise taxes that high, you stifle growth. Bhagat's answer is what makes this manifesto so radical.
Yep.
He says, if tax revenue isn't enough to cover it, the central bank should just print the money. He calls it targeted quantitative easing.
This is where we have to carefully unpack the economic theory he is leveraging. We really need to look at what traditional quantitative easing actually is and how Bhagat re-engineers it for this blueprint.
Let's do that. Because printing money to hand out cash sounds, to a lot of people, like a terrifying recipe for hyperinflation.
Yeah.
We all know the historical nightmares, the Weimar Republic, Zimbabwe, where people were using wheelbarrows of cash to buy a single loaf of bread because the currency became worthless.
Right.
How does the author justify injecting raw liquidity without blowing up the economy?
To understand his defense, you have to look at traditional quantitative easing, or QE. Following the 2008 financial crisis, and again during the 2020 pandemic lockdowns, Central banks, like the U.S. Federal Reserve, essentially created trillions of dollars out of thin air.
Trillions.
But they didn't hand it to citizens. They used it to buy government bonds and mortgage-backed securities from massive commercial banks.
The logic being that if the banks are flooded with cash, they'll lower interest rates, lend money to businesses, and stimulate the economy.
Right, that's the theory. But the widespread criticism of traditional QE is that the newly printed money gets trapped at the top of the financial system.
It doesn't trickle down.
Exactly. Banks might hoard the reserves to repair their own balance sheets. Or the cheap capital flows directly into speculative assets, the stock market, real estate, cryptocurrency. It drives up asset prices, making the wealthy vastly richer on paper, while Main Street sees very little actual productive stimulus.
So Bhagat is looking at that mechanism and saying, look, we are already printing money out of thin air. We are just giving it to the wrong end of the pyramid.
Precisely. His proposal for targeted quantitative easing changes the injection point. Instead of printing money to buy financial assets from banks, the central bank prints the money and pushes it directly through the Aadhaar UPI grid into the digital wallets of the hungriest consumers, the bottom 10%.
Okay, but I have to push back here on the inflation argument because supply elasticity is not infinite.
Fair point.
If you drop $1 billion into an impoverished region, the local supply of tin roofs, rice, and medicine doesn't just magically multiply overnight. If demand skyrockets but supply stays the same, prices just go up. The local rice seller sees everyone has cash, so he doubles the price of rice. Doesn't the inflation just eat the value of the transfer?
The manifesto anticipates exactly this criticism. And Phagat's counter-argument hinges on the concept of the velocity of money and the specific nature of bottom-decile consumption.
Explain the velocity of money in this context.
Okay, so if you give a billionaire an extra $10,000, their daily consumption doesn't change, right?
Right. They don't suddenly eat more.
They don't buy an extra 1,000 loaves of bread. They route that money into a savings account or an index fund. The money sits still. But if you give an individual living in extreme poverty $100, their marginal propensity to consume is practically 100%. They spend it instantly.
Because they have urgent, unmet physical needs. They buy food, they fix a leaking roof, they pay a local tutor for their kid.
Right. And that immediate spending becomes instant, localized income. The person buys vegetables. The local farmer suddenly has more income.
Yeah.
The farmer takes that income and hires a local laborer to repair a tractor. The laborer takes those wages and buys shoes from the local cobbler. That $100 changes hands 5, 6, 7 times within the local microeconomy in a matter of days. That high velocity generates a massive multiplier effect.
But what about the supply side? You still haven't solved the rice seller doubling his prices.
Phagat argues that at the bottom of the economic pyramid, supply is highly elastic for basic goods because there is massive underutilized labor.
Oh, I see.
If the demand for rice goes up, the local agricultural market responds. People will plant more, transport more, and compete for that new influx of reliable capital. It sparks micro-entrepreneurship.
So the supply catches up to the demand.
He posits that because the money is spent on real economy needs, basic goods and services, rather than being hoarded for financial speculation, local supply chains organically expand to absorb the liquidity, keeping inflationary pressures minimal while maximizing real growth.
The text literally calls this stimulus on steroids without the steroid side effects. It is a fascinating macroeconomic hypothesis. We bypass the banking sector entirely. The central bank interfaces directly with the poorest citizens via a biometric grid.
It's a bold claim.
Now, again, traditional economists might argue that localized inflation is still inevitable or that this disincentivizes work. We are presenting the architecture of his argument so you can weigh the mechanics yourself.
It fundamentally challenges our assumptions about who can be trusted with raw liquidity. Historically, states trust banks with printed money, assuming they will allocate it efficiently. Phagat argues we should trust the poorest individuals, assuming their survival instincts will allocate it far more productively for the real economy.
So we have the frictionless digital ID grid. We have the unconditional cash flowing through it to solve immediate physical deprivation. But the blueprint acknowledges a glaring reality. Cash only solves the hunger of today.
Right.
It puts a roof over your head this month. It does not necessarily give you the internal tools to permanently escape the bottom 10%. If the cash bazooka ever gets turned off, you might fall right back down.
Exactly. Welfare, even perfectly delivered, is maintenance. It is not necessarily upward mobility. Which brings us to step 3, the capability layer, the ultimate force multiplier.
The manifesto argues that permanent escape from poverty requires capabilities, specifically education and skills.
Yeah.
And Fagat's solution here is arguably the most futuristic element of the entire stack.
Oh, without a doubt.
He proposes giving every citizen a personal AI tutor, available 24/7 on their smartphone, speaking fluently in their native mother tongue.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this shifts the entire blueprint from a purely economic intervention to a cognitive one. Poverty isn't just an absence of capital. It's an absence of access to the knowledge networks required to navigate and thrive in a complex modern economy.
Let's visualize the use cases here because they highlight the bottleneck of human capital. Imagine a child in a deeply impoverished, remote village. Historically, their educational outcome is dictated entirely by the geographic lottery of their local school.
And in many developing regions, those local schools are severely underfunded. They lack basic learning materials, the classrooms are overcrowded, and they suffer from really high rates of teacher absenteeism.
Right.
Even if a teacher is present, they cannot provide individualized attention to 50 kids who are all at different reading levels.
But with a personal AI tutor deployed to a $50 smartphone, Fagat envisions an infinitely patient, hyper-personalized educator.
Infinitely patient, yeah.
An AI that dynamically adapts to that specific child's learning pace. If the child doesn't understand a math concept, the AI doesn't get frustrated and move on to the next chapter. It explains the concept visually. It tries an analogy based on local agriculture. It quizzes them gently, tracks their cognitive progression in real time, and scales the difficulty perfectly.
And this isn't restricted to primary education either. The text explicitly points out the impact on adult upskilling.
Oh, that's huge.
Imagine an adult in that same village who wants to learn advanced agricultural techniques, or improve their English to interact with broader markets, or just gain financial literacy to manage their new unconditional cash transfers. They can access world-class vocational training without leaving their home, without paying tuition, and without adhering to a rigid schedule.
And the cultural fluency aspect is heavily emphasized. The blueprint stresses that the AI tutor must know the local culture and sync the user's mother tongue. This is vital.
Absolutely vital.
It cannot be a generic, Western-centric large language model that has just been run through a clunky translation filter. It has to be a native language instructor that intuitively understands the user's social and economic context.
This completely bypasses the traditional constraints of state building. I mean, developing a nation typically requires building thousands of physical schools and spending decades training an army of high-quality human educators. It takes generations. Fagat is suggesting we can leapfrog that entire infrastructural phase using generative AI.
There's an incredibly profound cost-benefit analysis at play here. The manifesto notes that the initial cost of developing and training these massive AI models is astronomically high. We are talking billions of dollars in compute, data curation, and engineering.
Sure.
But once the foundational model is trained, the marginal cost of deploying it to one more smartphone is effectively zero.
The cost is negligible once the models are trained. That is the core economic principle of software.
You train it once, you copy it infinitely. So an impoverished nation doesn't need a $1 trillion education budget to upskill its population. It just needs to license or develop a centralized AI model and push it over the existing mobile network, the M and the Jam Trinity we talked about earlier.
The payoff, according to the text, is a generational transformation. You engineer a population that is healthier, highly skilled, hyper-entrepreneurial, and structurally immune to falling back into extreme poverty.
There's a line in the manifesto that really crystallizes this entire philosophy. Cash buys today, AI buys tomorrow.
That's a great line.
It's the ultimate evolution of the teach a man to fish proverb. We aren't just giving them a fish today with the cash transfer. We are putting a world-class, culturally fluent robotic fishing instructor right in their pocket. It attacks both the immediate symptoms of poverty and the root causes simultaneously.
It effectively turns every cheap, cracked smartphone on the planet into a customized, Ivy League quality global classroom.
And this brings us to the grand synthesis of Fagat's entire vision. We have to look at how these three pillars, the biometric grid, the unconditional cash, and the AI tutors, interact holistically to create what he calls the age of abundance.
The manifesto summarizes why this specific technological stack succeeds where decades of traditional anti-poverty programs have failed. Traditional programs, the text argues, fail for three highly predictable reasons. They are incredibly leaky, they are agonizingly slow, and they only treat the symptoms.
And Fagat's blueprint is engineered to address each of those failure points directly.
Exactly.
The digital identity and instant banking system plugs the leaks. The biometric deduplication eliminates the ghosts and the middlemen.
Right.
The algorithmic delivery of unconditional cash removes the delays and the bureaucratic friction. And the combination of immediate liquidity plus long-term AI education attacks both the symptoms and the root causes simultaneously.
What is particularly striking is the administrative minimalism of this vision. The text explicitly states, no new ministries are required, no army of inspectors.
It's so streamlined.
It boils down to 3 execution steps. Finish the grid, push the cash, deploy the AI. It bypasses the state bureaucracy almost entirely.
It is important to view this manifesto within the broader intellectual context of the author's work, too. Paramendra Kumar Bhagat isn't just writing about poverty in a vacuum. If you look at the index of his blog and his other publications referenced in the source material, he is weaving this into a much larger macroeconomic and spiritual framework.
Right. He writes extensively about the arrival of agentic AI in 2026, and he frames this within a concept he calls Kalkism, which he explores in his other writings as a comprehensive blueprint for this prophesied age of abundance.
He is looking at the convergence of distinct technological trajectories. He sees the frictionless payment rails, the cryptographic identity grids, and the explosive capabilities of generative AI not as separate industries, but as interlocking pieces of a new societal operating system.
A total operating system upgrade.
And the central thesis of this specific manifesto is that because these technologies now exist, and because they have been proven at scale like Aadhaar managing 1.4 billion people, the barrier to ending poverty is no longer technical.
The text makes a very definitive, almost challenging concluding statement. The technology already exists. The economic logic is sound. The only missing ingredient is the political will to execute at speed and at scale.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? By framing it this way, he fundamentally redefines the moral nature of poverty.
Yes.
If poverty is not an inevitable sociological condition, but rather a solvable engineering problem, and if the tools to solve that problem are currently sitting in our data centers and in our pockets, then the continued existence of extreme poverty is no longer a passive human tragedy. It becomes an active daily political choice.
That is a heavy realization, synthesizing how the author views poverty. It's a solved engineering problem merely waiting for execution.
That brings us back to what this means for the broader global landscape. Whether you agree with the mechanics of targeted quantitative easing, or whether you fear the dystopian surveillance implications of centralized biometric grids, the core premise of this manifesto is practically undeniable.
The physical and computational tools to fundamentally alter the human condition have already been built. They are humming on our server farms right now.
Understanding the intersection of these forces, where macroeconomics meets artificial intelligence meets national digital infrastructure, is absolutely crucial for anyone trying to navigate the next decade. Because these aren't hypothetical white papers. These systems are being deployed, refined, and scaled across billions of human lives as we speak.
Let's recap the intense journey we've been on today. We explored a 3-pillar system. First, the biometric financial grid, the Aadhaar and UPI infrastructure that makes instant delivery possible while grappling with its real human costs.
The exclusion errors and data surveillance.
Second, the controversial proposal of targeted quantitative easing to fund unconditional cash transfers.
The cash bazooka.
Exactly, pushing cash directly to the bottom decile to surge the velocity of money in local microeconomies. And third, the deployment of native language AI tutors to secure long-term upward mobility.
It is an incredibly cohesive, fiercely ambitious blueprint that challenges almost every orthodox assumption we have about welfare, state capacity, and the role of money in society. Whether you are a tech enthusiast, an economics buff, or just insanely curious, this stuff is vital.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over, building on that last pillar of the AI tutor.
I love these. Hit me.
Consider the AI tutors. If an AI can perfectly adapt to a marginalized student's culture and learning style, doing a demonstrably better job than an underfunded local school, what happens to our traditional global education systems?
Wait, play that up.
Will the poorest 10%, armed with world-class, individualized AI instruction, suddenly possess a sharper, more modern educational foundation than the middle class who remain tethered to rigid legacy schooling model?
Why?
Could AI not just equalize the playing field, but actually invert the entire educational pyramid?
That is a wild, completely counterintuitive thought, a total inversion of the status quo. It just highlights how complex and incredibly exciting this frontier truly is. We started this deep dive talking at the slow, generational slog of fighting poverty with a teaspoon, and we ended up looking at a blueprint that treats it like a solvable engineering problem.
Just like patching a massive, inefficient legacy software system. You build the identity protocol, you route the liquidity, you deploy the intelligence, and the system heals.
It is a bold, uncompromising vision for 2026. Thank you so much for joining us on this intellectual deep dive today. We love taking these complex, world-shifting architectures and breaking them down piece by piece. The joy of discovery, of seeing how these massive gears interlock, is exactly why we do this. Until next time, keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking for the underlying mechanics, and we will see you on the next deep dive.